Hi folks, Jason here. So in part two of the shack project, I've basically taken the model now and I've put it into Substance Painter, and basically over the course of say the next sort of 10 minutes or so, it's going to do a time lapse of the process and just talk you through what I was thinking when I was creating it. So here we go. So essentially I'm just opening up Substance Painter and bringing in the project and baking the mesh maps and getting all of that done, renaming all the different elements because I'd separated the the roof and the beams and all of that, applying a basic wooden material to this, playing around with the colors, trying to kind of get it as near to the illustration as possible, adding a bit of purple in there, and there's a bit of sort of greenish in there as well, so just having to play around and then scattering in a bit of sort of dirt, bit of grime, and blending that in there as well. So spent a bit of time on this. I wasn't aiming like for an exact replica of the illustration, just something kind of close to it. So once I've kind of like established the kind of color, then move on to painting in a bit more grime in here, and also looking at, because it's low poly, I wanted to kind of create this kind of like high poly effect on it, so we'll come to that shortly. But for here it's just mainly just putting a bit of grime in where like the hole is for the in the roof, in the shack, and again just moving some of that around, and then putting some under the lips, as it were, just to kind of define the boards a little bit more, and then doing a bit on the porch and just moving around and just trying to kind of get like overall sense. So really it's just a bit like adding stuff, taking it away and stuff like that, and then I start working into these edges. It's quite tricky to do, trying to kind of create that kind of chiseled, beveled look, but basically I was kind of painting on both sides of the face, so on the top and the side, but like moving it around. I think the results work in the end, but it's always like a bit of a gamble, and I was kind of like, is it working out? Is it not working out? But it kind of worked out, considering that it's kind of low poly. So I deliberately avoided going into Blender or into ZBrush or anything like that. Just simply to see if it's possible to kind of get that kind of modeled kind of high mesh sort of effect. So yeah, so just kind of chiseling those edges with a bit of paint. And then what I was doing is I was taking the smudge tool and just kind of blending it a little bit, just so it wasn't so harsh, just so it blended in with the rest of the colours. And then after I did the roof, I sort of worked on the little porch area as well. You can see there. And then I think at some point we then move on to the onto the wooden beams. I think I'll come to that a little bit, but I think I'm just doing a bit of touching up here with the hole in the roof. So there we go to the beam. So again, I'm just laying on like a very basic wooden texture, changing the colours, trying to kind of get it close to like the original. But again, I sort of took a lot of this kind of down. I was trying to like really desaturate it and then work into it. So in the original illustration, there's lots of kind of like orangey, yellowy kind of tinges to it. Rare games do this kind of effect where it's kind of very like painterly, so you kind of get these sort of washes of kind of colour and stuff like that. And then on the edge, instead of going with light, I ended up sort of going on with a darker colour and trying to kind of create that chiseled effect. And I think it worked out quite well, because I deliberately avoided doing the sculpt. I thought, well, I'll try and paint it in. I think it works well, as it stands. If you want to kind of go low poly but kind of create that high poly kind of effect, this could be one approach for you. So yeah, so I'm just going through, essentially just going through the each beam. It's a little bit laborious, but there isn't really a generator to kind of do this. There's generators when you kind of create a black mask and then you put like a generator in there. There didn't appear to be anything like that, so you have to kind of, some things you just have to kind of do by hand, which is what I did here. So it's one of those things where it's a little bit laborious, but stick some music on and just kind of get your head down, get on with it, and you've got it done in no time. So yeah, it's just going through each beam again, just really just repeating the same method. Really, you can see there it's just the same pattern. It's just like rinse, repeat, but the end result is you kind of have that nice kind of chiseled effect. And then we've got the main house, and again applied, this time instead of applying wood, I downloaded some kind of wooden panel textures from textures.com, and then I was trying to overlay it onto the house. Now it's quite difficult if you just try and do it with a layer and do it that way. It doesn't quite match up. If you put it into, like, say, a fill layer, which is what I do shortly, and then try and match it up, it's still quite difficult when you're playing around with things like scale and you're trying to rotate it. So what I did was I ended up, I think it'll come up shortly, I ended up creating this kind of projection. I forget the name of it now, but basically you might see it in a minute, where essentially you create a fill layer and then you apply this projection, but it allows you to kind of line things up. I think you can just see it there. It's triplane there. I think it's triplanar projection, and it allows you, as long as it's tileable, it'll allow you to kind of match things up, so you're not having to kind of like mess around with it. So I've put that as the base layer in there. Then essentially I've got, like, of all things, I've got like artificial leather material, just to kind of, because it's got like a bump on it, and I was just kind of doing in between the boards. So I was just kind of like just holding down shift and just painting those boards too. And then from here, basically just putting these lines in and essentially just creating like a bit of a bump, because what I'm going to be doing shortly is just overlaying some paint on there and creating that kind of cracked paint effect. So it's just really laying the groundwork on that. And then you can see here, basically I put this kind of plasticky kind of material on there, and I just start kind of putting it in there. I have a bit of a play just to sort of see what kind of cracked paint effect I can get in there. I was kind of playing around with the height and things like that. And then yeah, and then just basically working into it again, so just taking parts of it away and adding parts of it again, and just really working into it. So it's kind of an old shack, so the idea is that all the paint is just kind of peeling away. It's all been weathered and things like that. So I spent a bit of time doing that and just putting that cracked effect, and then afterwards sort of added another layer, and with that layer I ended up sort of putting some grime on there, and you know, creating this kind of, you know, the way that you kind of get dirt in rain, and it kind of layers and layers and layers. So that was the kind of, that's the effect I'm going to be going for shortly with it. But in the meantime, just laying these parts in with the cracked paint. And again, with on the illustration, you'll see there are also some slats that are kind of running vertically. So I use the same material, obviously, as the base, but then just kind of changed it around, put a bit of a bump in there with that leather material, and then just did the same thing, because you can't really tell. I did a bit of blacking in on the top there, just so you couldn't sort of see the roof, and then this is where I kind of add a bit of grime and just kind of, yeah, just dirtying it up a little bit, and then just using the smudge tool just to kind of move parts of it around. Again, it's a little bit of a deviation from the original, but I just kind of wanted to give it my own little kind of stamp, as it were. And one of the things I didn't think about was as I'm sort of just talking about this, is the doorway. So you see there, I didn't actually calculate it, simply because it's not there in the illustration, but I kind of thought about it afterwards, and I thought, well, how come I didn't put one in? So you'll see here, I kind of go through lots of different iterations where I'm kind of just put a door in and I take it away. That's not quite working. So I think it's just like a word to the wise would be, when you're doing stuff like this, think about the things that you can't see, try and anticipate it, and then try and sort of factor that in. So what I've done here is I think I just went online and just got a picture of like a door to a shack, and essentially I was going to sort of project onto there, but I think I wasn't quite happy with the first image. I think eventually when I kind of put it on there, it wasn't quite fitting with the overall film. I think it was a little bit too short, So I ended up kind of going off and having a look and seeing if I can find like another picture with a different type of door, and I kind of put that in there. And once I kind of got it in there, then I sort of put it in place, and it seemed to kind of fit with it. But again, it was quite flat, so I ended up working into it with a brush with a bit of a bump on it, so at least kind of created a bit of a recess. And then here, just very basic kind of metal, just dragged some metal material on there, and then just sort of dirtied it up a little bit with some black material, just kind of create this kind of soot effect. With this kind of arm that's kind of coming out of the roof as well. And just applying that kind of chiseled kind of effect to it. It's a kind of like bluish texture for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why, but yeah. And then from there, I think the last thing, as we kind of get to really the last kind of quarter of this, is working on the windows. And again, I think in retrospect, I should have allowed a little bit more room for these. They ended up being quite small, I think, when I did the layout of the UVs, and so they probably could have done with being a little bit bigger, because the effect was quite sort of pixelated, so they must have been sort of quite small. I think this is, as I said in the previous video, I kind of ran out of time a little bit as I was doing the videos, because obviously these things take quite a lot of time to do, and yeah, that was the only kind of thing. There's the odd mistake here and there, but yeah. So I think what I decided to do here was I was attempted to paint into it. I put like a very basic kind of paint effect in here eventually, and then what I did was I ended up doing a screen grab of it, and then I put the screen grab into Photoshop, and then basically just try and sharpen it up that way, as opposed to trying to kind of paint on the model. And then that way I can then just kind of project it back onto the model and not have to kind of like redo lots of different windows. I think there's 4 in total. So here, basically, this is what I was doing. I was just kind of blocking in some of the colour. This is kind of like frame. Then there's this kind of like blue colour, which is, I think, is supposed to be like the glass. It's like metallic. And then over the top of that, there's a kind of goldy kind of rim to it. So I thought I'll do that, and then what I do was I sort of do a screen grab of it. I think I tried to kind of clone it initially. It didn't quite work out. So I ended up doing a screen grab, and then, well, you'll see in a second, I ended up sort of putting it into Photoshop. And there in Photoshop, I'm able to kind of just work into it a little bit more, put a few kind of highlights on there around on the sort of gold, and just make it look a bit more defined. It was just looking a bit horrid and a bit pixelated. It was still a little bit pixelated when I eventually take it back into Substance Painter, but it kind of works. It kind of works okay. I mean, a lot of this stuff is like a learning curve when you're doing it. You know, particularly if you're doing it for the first time. You know, in retrospect, there's probably a lot of things I'd kind of do differently if I was going to do this again. But as it stands, you know, I think it turned out quite well, really. I think the end result was okay, you know, as an asset that you could kind of put into an environment. So I was, you know, I was relatively happy with it as it goes. So yeah, just doing some additional stuff. There's these kind of supports that are kind of underneath the beam there. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be ornate or they have some kind of function, but so I'm putting those in there. But we're really just approaching the end now. I think I end up just doing like a bit of a render of it, just in situ, and yeah, you'll see it in a second. But all in all, though, hopefully you've enjoyed these videos, and it's given you some little insight about what you can kind of do, particularly whether it's in Maya or in Substance Painter. And yeah, it's hopefully you find it inspiring, and it'll give you some ideas about what you can do with your own projects. So until next time, folks, thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye for now.